Welcome to Joining the Dots. I'm Thomas Strohan, your host. This podcast explores real-life insights from those dedicated to pursuing justice, reducing harm, and enhancing global security. As co-founder of Clue Software and a technologist, I collaborate daily with diverse teams tackling some of the most pervasive problems in the world, ranging from child abuse to human trafficking, organised crime, fraud, and much more. In Joining the Dots, I speak with those deeply entrenched in these worlds. The victims, the perpetrators, the investigators, the leaders, the techies, the academics. The often unsung heroes on the front line, working to tirelessly create a safer world. Welcome to Joining the Dots. Hi, and welcome to today's episode. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Adam Pacifico. Adam is a partner at leadership consultancy Heidrick & Struggles in London, with nearly 30 years of multifaceted experience in law enforcement and leadership advisory roles. Beginning his career as a barrister, Adam then joined the Metropolitan Police, serving on proactive teams and training specialist officers across the UK. His law enforcement background includes assisting the prosecution team of the International Criminal Court during the International Tribunal. Transitioning back into law as a barrister once again, Adam's career saw him prosecuting and defending in criminal courts. He later held leadership roles in a number of corporations. Adam is also host to a globally ranked podcast, the Leadership Enigma, and he has interviewed many of the most high-profile and interesting leaders in the world. Co-author of The Leader's Secret Code, shortlisted for Business Book of the Year 2020, Adam is renowned for his work across sectors, levels, geographies, enhancing leadership development and developing strategic change initiatives. So I'm sure that you can picture some of the interesting themes that are emerging just from that. Being a barrister, being a cop, being a globally renowned voice in leadership, and all that it includes. So loads to dig into today. So I'd like to start by saying welcome, Adam.
Thank you very much. I don't recognise that person you've just described there, but it's I'll try and do my best to justify it.
That's not the first time that that's been said in this scenario. So hopefully it's relatively accurate. But
thank you.
But yeah, so just to orientate you and our listeners. We have a consistent format for this. We kick off with the same question, which explores why you chose the path you chose. We then get into the main part of the discussion, which I think we've alluded to a bit of that already.
Yep.
And then we get into the last bit of the session where we talk about crystal ball gazing. You know, we transport ourselves into 2030 and we make some predictions about the future.
Okay.
So if you're comfortable with that, we'll kick off.
Lovely.
Great. Okay, so the pivotal moment that ultimately led you to your chosen path, and also interested to understand the moment where you started to realise that technology would have an impact on that as well.
Okay, well, I suppose I've got a slightly eclectic, or some might say strange, background, because there aren't that many people who have become a barrister and then become a police officer and then gone back to being a barrister. I think historically we've seen more cops become barristers, not the other way around. So I qualified at the bar early. I think I was 21, 22. Perhaps too early in relation to the life skills that I would need in those situations. I was drawn to the bar because of family. So we had a couple of barristers within the family. One was a fairly renowned one, Michael Sherrard, then QC, a head of chambers, who was very well known within the profession, was doing some of the most high profile cases in the country. And so in some ways I looked up to him growing up. And I early memory of being at a family wedding, and it was in Middle Temple, and what was I, 12 or 13, and sat behind his desk, and they put the white wig on me, and they said, "Oh, is this what you're?" I mean, who knows, right? And lo and behold, that's what I ended up doing, perhaps without really thinking. And I think I said earlier that I always remember my head mistress's advice in a report to me, where she said that I probably overestimate certainly overestimate my ability and underestimate the challenge ahead of me. And I think her advice was, no, you won't be going to the bar. So I did. And with that, why did I go to the bar? I think, yes, there was definitely a role model within the family that I looked up to. But also I think I was insatiably curious just in relation to why people did certain things. And let's be honest, I probably watched too much of LA Law, which at the time was on our televisions. Yeah. So to the bar I went. I was lucky. I think in relation to the qualifications or level of qualifications I had and where I ended up. And I had a great period of time working for 11 South Square, which is a wonderful criminal set. And I really cut my teeth there. But long story short, the set that I was in imploded, and then I bounced around a few other sets, and so I did the prosecuting and defending for about 3 or 4 years, and then came to a point where someone said, why don't you become a cop? Because I had friends who were cops. So that's not an obvious transition,
No. Yeah.
but again, I think it appealed to my sense of justice, curiosity, working with people, and I also think that I was looking for purpose. And I think working within the criminal justice sector for me felt like a great purpose. So into the Metropolitan Police I went.
Because I assume it also wasn't a financial decision.
No, do you know what? Everyone says that. They said, oh my God, you must have been earning. I thought, well, no, if anyone's actually done criminal law under legal aid, you'll understand that there are still to this day enormous difficulties from a financial perspective. So no, and as a young man, what was I, 21 to 25, then 25 into the police? No. And I'm not married at this time, no kids, so it's just me to look after. So it wasn't a big financial transition. But I also think that what I was doing, or what I did at the bar, complemented and reinforcing what I had to do at the academy, and then going on to the streets of London.
Yeah.
And I think, by the way, that 6 years in the Met also gave me, I think, the people skills that have stood me in good stead. Because let's be honest, it will be your people skills that keep you safe, probably not your knowledge of the law.
Yeah.
Not quite.
Yeah, and what about at some point during that journey where you sort of hit that sort of, oh, wait a minute, technology could help. So, I've interviewed other people, like an investigator, a chap called Peter Spindler, and, he alluded to all of a sudden, he involved in a case with just millions of pieces of data, and all of a sudden he read, right, okay, yeah, this is going to be quite a big thing for me, technology. Did you have a similar sort of moment that you can sort of think back to, or was it just a gradual thing?
Well, things have changed a lot. If you think of 3 decades, when I first joined the job, when I first joined the police, I think it was a pager, an orange pager, and
proudly.
Oh, absolutely. You click to your belt. You had a little chain which you tagged to it as well, and almost like an old movie. These things would go off. We'd all look at them, and then you read the message or make the phone call.
Yeah, and I can remember feeling quite proud when I had one when I was a teen. My dad got me when I was a teenager, and when it went off, he'd be like, "Hey, see what's going on here?"
Oh, it was all the rage, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So none of us had phones. We all had pagers, and then they'd go off, and then you'd try and find the phone. And then very quickly, the mobiles started to come out, and we were just chatting before we started recording. We went about the Nokia, was it 8310?
Yes.
Which was a wonderful bit of kit, wasn't it?
Yeah, the brick. Yeah.
The brick, but you could literally, indestructible brick, drive over it, throw it off a building, still go. Yeah. What was it, 100 numbers in it, made calls, received calls. It was a joy.
Charge once a week.
Exactly. It did exactly what it was meant to do. And then I think, things have now, if you think shuttle forward 30 years, not even, the rate of change is enormous. And that has helped how we're now paperless in everything that we do. I mean, we'll get on to, I'm sure, generative AI and how that's now guiding us. But everything has changed. Everyone now has a digital footprint. I did a lot of work post the police and then back into law in relation to comms data.
Yep.
And I just think everything has changed, and we're never going back to how it was.
No. But
technology is now an inevitable element in all our lives, regardless of whether we're investigating something or just day-to-day life. From kind of 10 years onwards, it's everywhere.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go back to what I think is a really interesting dynamic, which is this concept of you becoming a barrister, then going into policing, and going back out of it. We have, as Clue, we have an annual user conference, and a couple of years ago we had a keynote from a chap called Chris Dorr, KC,
who's been a guest on the podcast.
On your podcast? Yeah. Oh right, okay. So he's a friend of Clue, so he came and did a sort of keynote at our conference. So you can picture at our conference we just had a couple of hundred intelligence and investigation professionals. Yep. And he did just a really he got the tone perfect. So he said, here I am. These are the kind of so this chap, you will obviously know this, but it's involved in lots of very high profile cases. And he just sort of communicated in a non-condescending, very supportive way some of the gotchas, the classic gotchas that an investigation team or intelligence team are developing. And then when it gets to court, what are these things you've done? I just wonder, reflecting on that, you've been in both those scenarios, both as a barrister receiving, an evidence package from an investigator, and as an investigator having to give it over to the prosecution, if you like, or the defence. What are some of the lessons you've learned from your experience?
Well, if I hark back now, one of the roles that I did have in the police was actually sergeant in the criminal justice unit, which was actually reviewing the paperwork, and it really was the paperwork and all the MG forms, and I know that all of that now is electronic. But we were again reminiscing in the car.
You'd be surprised, actually.
Really?
No. Some of these complex cases, it's difficult to send them directly to the CPS. So some organisations still. So for the benefit of international listeners, this is the case, all the documentation, the digital documentation that is the output from an investigation. You create it and you send it to a court. And I was making the point that often it's still sent via a CD-ROM, for example. Yeah. That's better than 1,000 pieces of paper, but it's still not perfectly integrated yet. But we're getting there.
Well, let's talk about some memories then, and we can still think about how they're relevant now, how technology is started to play a part in them. I think one of the things I was always intrigued by, and I'm still intrigued, is the passage of time, because things happen at hyper speed, sometimes on the street. And I'm thinking maybe of a criminal matter or anything, any incident. Yeah. And actually, our memories are quite perishable in a very, very short space of time. And there are things, as I say, we were coming up in the car today, there are things that I will never forget because they are kind of high impact. And I can tell you various levels of detail about that from 20, 25 years ago, because they were serious and they were impactful and they were memorable. But in relation to the detail, the devil in the detail, a name and an address, an index number, etc., that's highly perishable. So I was always interested in relation to when is someone actually making a note of some of the detail that they're now seeking to rely on at a later date. And I don't think all detail is in the same category. Some is incredibly perishable and some is long lasting, like the description I gave you. Yeah. So I was always intrigued, both as a lawyer and as a police officer, about when did you start to record this detail and where did you get it from? Has something happened in the interim which is in some ways now impacting or created any kind of bias, or 2 and 2 = 5 in the recollection? So I was always intrigued about that. Where is that coming from?
And is that because you saw that as a barrister, you saw these case files and you were just like, there's gaps here, and then when you get into policing, you're like, okay, I know that because I've seen it. So how do we,
Well, it's like a classic one, isn't it? Is maybe someone is chasing a suspect and there's not an immediate description given, but actually the description in the statement is one that's taken, but actually giving the description of the person they've arrested because they're looking at them in the custody office. Well, that's where it's coming from, not the incident in the street. And the reality was, well, hang on, is that the same person you were chasing down the street 20 minutes ago? And so it's looking at that kind of memory recall. What's been the passage of time, and what are you actually seeking to rely on? So I think that's an interesting one, and I think that's an interesting one for all investigators, because you're just trying to work out where is it coming from, where is the devil of the detail coming from? Because that was one of the first things. One of the things I was always intrigued by was people making decisions all the time and recording that decision, but on many occasions not actually recording the rationale, as in what's your workings out. What are you actually seeing, hearing, thinking that's allowing you to make a decision? Because the reality might be that decision was wrong, but when you understand the circumstances in which you made it, it doesn't matter that it was wrong. But sometimes I saw many occasions that I made decision X and we're all left wondering why or how you came to that decision. And then 5, 10, 15 years later, you've got no chance to remember.
We see it all the time. We see it all the time. A lot of the national scandals and that erupt in the media, and then you get back and you look at the I'm thinking about certain safeguarding issues like in faith groups or in NGOs and things that we've seen erupt in the media. Yeah, and you look back at it and there's no indication of what happened. So certain decisions, like we chose not to progress a line of inquiry against this who is now a known abuser because of these reasons, but it's not recorded anywhere. Yeah. So they've got a leg to stand on. So therefore, you get this reputation as an organisation with poor governance and poor recording of information. Yeah. And it's a similar within police as
there was always the saying, if it's not written down, it never happened. Yeah. So that was also another thing that I I took from being a barrister into being a police officer was to write good notes. Thorough, but you can't say they're exhaustive notes because you'd be writing till doomsday. But it's about the thoroughness of the notes that have given you all of the context and all of the available information so that people can understand what happened. What did you see? What did you do? Why did you, etc. And sometimes, you used to read notes and think to yourself, it's just too sparse. It's too bitty, or it's 1 + 1 = 3. How on earth did you get to that? So those were some of the things that I remember. I know there's kind of always around memory, decision making, and kind of note taking.
Yeah. I wonder also, as a barrister, putting your barrister hat on, whether I imagine, speaking to lots of the people I do, they're working on highly complex cases with thousands of bits of data, lots of lines of inquiry. Sometimes I think some of the struggles that investigators have is in describing that in a concise way so that another human being can understand it. A member of the jury, for example, who would, in non-technical terms, but in enough detail to make it credible and stand up to scrutiny by a defence. I wonder if there's any sort of lessons that you've learnt along that sort of journey.
I think the ability to explain something that's very complex in very simple terms needs a great deal of thought. So I've spent my life working with forensics teams or analysts or comms data specialists or specialists in some way, shape or form. And that ability to explain it to a judge and a jury in simple terms, I think is incredibly difficult. And it's something that's got to be thought through. And a lot of people just haven't thought about that. And then what comes out perhaps in a courtroom is complete gobbledygook. And they're trying to simplify something, and actually they're overcomplicating it again. So it was always something that we spoke to people about, to say, keep it simple and keep it. I always used to say, does it pass the mum test? And my mum, bless her, always wanted to be on a jury when she was alive. She never got the chance. They always said, does it pass the mum test? And people said, what do you mean? I said, does my mum understand it? And doesn't mean she's not bright, but she doesn't come from this world, doesn't come from criminal justice, doesn't come from the law and order. So if you're explaining it, does my mum get it? And I think that was always a good acid test in relation to any kind of explanation. And we've worked with lots of teams before to try and help them simplify how you would explain it to a third party. So someone says, okay, I understand that. As a layperson, I get it.
And does pictures form a part of that? Visuals, charts.
Picture paints 1,000 words,
yeah.
Right? I think that's not just in a courtroom scenario, that's in anything. I think it's just how we're wired. So I always used to say a picture paints 1,000 words. So some of the work that was done by analysts in relation to how people were networked, or crime scene photos, or forensics, etc., are incredibly important. And I remember there was an aircraft. I wasn't involved in this. There was an aircraft crash. And they had the black box voice recorder, and what they'd done is they'd recreated like a 3D model of the flight with the black box voice recorder, so all the topography, everything. And actually one of the original arguments that actually they felt that its prejudicial value outweighed its probative value, because there was an argument there that it was so compelling, but actually the 3D imaging, they were saying, that we don't know that's correct, but obviously the voice recorder, black box voice recorder, we do know is correct. There was always this debate that you had to make sure that whatever you were putting in front of a court was absolutely correct. And in some ways there was no chance for error in that, which I understand, because it's very powerful when you're looking at something as well as listening to something.
And I suppose these were some of the skills that when you became a police officer that would have been really useful. Were really useful to your colleagues at the Metropolitan Police.
Yeah, I mean, certainly when we talked about exhibits, for instance, and talking about an exhibit and handling exhibit, in some ways, people are now seeing you as well as listening to you. That's quite a powerful dynamic. And I remember actually, one of the greatest lessons I learned was, when you've got it wrong, and I made lots of mistakes, just admit your mistakes. And I do remember one, I think I was the last person in the crime squad office, and they said, right, you're the exhibits officer, which is a godforsaken job if there are going to be a lot of exhibits, and there were. And I remember I'd got a certain exhibit wrong, I'd packaged it wrong, and then you have to open the bag and start again, but you've got a document, and then I repackaged it and I'd packaged it wrong again. And then I had to package, so I've packaged something 3 times. But what I've done is I've kept all the old packaging, and I've detailed exactly how useless I am in relation to this. And then there's just no issue, because it's like, well, you got it wrong once. Yeah, I did. And you got it wrong twice. Yeah, I did. And here is all the here's all that you need to understand that. Unfortunately, at that point in time, I wasn't very good.
Yeah, well, so
and it is what it is,
yeah,
but
yeah.
that's the error.
Yeah, I mean, when you said about that role as, I picture conversations I've had recently of another godforsaken role in this, which is a disclosure officer, which is just these poor people who have tens of thousands of documents that often need to be sort of redacted, sometimes by hand. They spend months in darkened rooms, putting stuff through lines.
I don't envy that role.
No. But equally, it still takes that understanding of context, that understanding that yes, it's clear there's certain information that you can't disclose, but how do you give enough information that they can get the general gist of what you've disclosed and all that sort of stuff? There's still a skill in that.
Yeah. And listen, I think, as a police officer, we sometimes had to deal with very difficult things, abhorrent things at face value. But I always had in the back of my mind that actually I was there to do everything I can to either prove or disprove somebody's involvement in an offence or series of offences. And I always used to think, hang on, if the person arrested was a family member or someone that I loved, you would want the system to behave in a way that it was there to completely make sure that no stone is unturned and you are there to prove and or disprove. So that was always the mindset. It was the mindset I shared with officers as well, to actually say, just be very careful of in some ways confirmation bias, but just think very widely, what is it that proves or disproves involvement? And then take it forward.
Yeah. I wonder if just briefly, if we could go into maybe a deep dive on an example. So you mentioned comms data earlier. Comms data is the information that a mobile phone company may give to an investigator, which can track their movements in accordance with their phones. But I can imagine that could be complex to describe that.
Hugely complex,
particularly if it's more than one phone, which it often is. I just wonder, from a practical perspective, as an example, how do you simplify that? What would you do in that scenario if you had, say, 20, 30 phones telling a story of an organised criminal group executing a certain plan?
Yeah. Well, I think there are a number of things that come into there. One is investigators always having that open mind in relation to what proves, what disproves, and having that's the arena of play. I think something else that we've already talked about as well was a picture paints 1,000 words. And I think sometimes when people were creating visual representation of what might be quite complex is very helpful. But then I think any individual has got to go through that massive challenge of how do I simplify fairly and objectively as best as I can what I do, why I do it, and how I do it. And I was never in that position of having to really explain highly complex material. But I remember working, as I say, with comms data specialists, and it was always probably one of the biggest fears that I had was how do I take what I do, maybe that I'm instinctive and automated because I've had many years of training, and now how do I explain that to a third party? Yeah. And I just think that takes a lot of thought before anybody can actually try and do that. You can't just rock up somewhere and think to yourself, I'll just very easily explain what I do. You've got to go through some kind of iterative thought process to think, well, hang on, how do I simplify what I do so it passes the MOM test?
Yeah, that's fascinating. I wonder if we should move towards the sort of leadership side of things. So I'm interested in from sort of barrister, cop, barrister, you sort of moved into some leadership roles. What was your logic for thinking, right, this is my direction of travel, and what was it that made you sort of move in that direction?
Yeah, I don't know whether it was deliberate, but I'm now seeing some themes. I think the insatiable curiosity continued. I was always fascinated in relation to why people do what they do. All the roles that I've had have been very people-focused, and that continues to be people-focused and behaviour-focused. And so perhaps moving into leadership felt right, and then I realised it was a continuum, really. But the curiosity piece, I think, has played a huge part in the work that I do. I think I was curious as a trial lawyer, curious as a police officer, and then curious in relation to the work that I do now. So if I had to pick one theme, it would probably be that insatiable curiosity. And that's continued. I think that's why I started the podcast and wrote the book and do the work that I do.
Yeah, I mean, I'm before this, I was sort of in a coffee shop, thinking through some classic dilemmas that people listening to this podcast are going to come across from a leadership perspective. And the most obvious one I landed on was, a bit of an operational one, but still a leadership challenge, which is this nuance that you when you're in this world, you might spot something about to happen, So you might get a piece of intelligence that is indicating that there could be a risk of something happening. You could take action early and perhaps avoid something bad happening there, but in so doing, you compromise the ability to take a longer term view, to actually find more evidence and actually get enough information to be able to, prevent this perpetrator from doing it again.
Yeah.
So effectively, effectively prosecuting them. So that's within the context. This is one of the big contexts, I think, of our domain. It's the consequence, life and death consequence in leadership. I wonder what reflections you have on that.
Well, I suppose sometimes you may not know the consequence further down the line of a decision that you've made, which is why I come back to something we spoke about, which was making sure you really detail the rationale behind any decision. And I think when something's black or white, then that's it, right, just simply right or wrong. That's easy for a leader, I'm going to suggest. I think when it becomes more complicated is when you're in this ever-expanding grey area. And you're now talking potentially about a decision like this has to be made before. There's no real playbook for it. There's no right or wrong for it. There might be some ethical considerations in there. And there might be some consequences that you haven't even considered, but they'll play out later on. That's why I think it's so important for people to understand what was the environment that you were in at the time of the decision, because we can all get something wrong, but then it's more difficult to criticize if you say, well, you made in the cold light of day, you've made the wrong decision. But actually understanding why you made that decision in the circumstances you found yourself in, there really is no criticism for you whatsoever. So I think I come back to that issue in relation to the rationale has got to be part of the decision making as opposed to just recording the decision itself. And I think, with the clients that I work with as well, I think ethical decision making is always critical in relation to a leader being able to navigate that grey space. And that's now even more important if we think about the world, because it's changing so fast. There is no leader who has all the answers to everything that's going on. It doesn't matter whether you're the CEO of one of the biggest companies in the world, you just simply don't have all the answers to everything that's going on. So you've really got to leverage the diversity of thought now, I think, in relation to navigating some of the biggest challenges that we're facing. So it all comes back to that ambiguity of decision making. And I also think if you're making a decision and you're leading people, it helps for people to understand why you're making a certain decision. Because again, someone might say, I don't agree with your decision, but I understand why you're making that now. Okay, I can follow that. So I keep coming back to this piece about rationale being so important to a decision itself.
Yeah, and I wonder also whether within some of the environments that the harm reduction and criminal justice, and the other thing that leaders have to deal with is pressure. And what I mean by that is it's often political pressure. There's sort of nuance there where how do you maintain integrity within the context of what you may perceive to be political or otherwise pressure within because it's such a grey area, not only in criminal investigations but just in corporate investigations. There's an overarching requirement for profit, right, within a corporation. I know there's ethics and all that sort of stuff, but how do you balance that with doing the right thing?
Yeah. Again, I think we're not talking about here something is very right or something is very wrong, because that's easier to navigate. I think at times of great crisis, and let's talk about the pandemic, for instance, where a lot of leaders that I speak to said they just didn't know how to navigate that, or what decisions to make, or what was going to be right, what was going to be wrong, what was good for one or good for all. And they were at sea. And we saw, didn't we, I think when the pandemic first happened, that some organisations were listed as saints and some were listed as sinners because of the decisions that they had. But I think a lot of leaders that I've spoken to who did well had very, very strong personal purpose, or they had a very strong North Star in relation to what was the direction of travel, what was the mission, or what was the purpose of the organisation, and allowing that almost to be their guide in relation to how they were to navigate whatever the crisis was and the decisions that they made. I think that's always quite helpful. And it's interesting, I've spoken again, I've asked this question to a number of leaders and said, how important is personal purpose to you and how you operate? And universally all will say it's incredibly important, but I'm not hearing an explicit personal purpose from enough of those leaders. But when I do hear it, it's actually pretty compelling. And I can give you one example, and I'm going to have to try and really test my memory now. So I've asked a lot of people, and there was one lady, and I interviewed her, and that's on the channel. And her name is Carol Kaufman, and she's actually Harvard faculty. And she's recognized by some as the #1 leadership coach in the world. So she is coaching some of the most powerful CEOs on the planet. And I talked to her prior to the show, and then I'm calling it a show now.
Yeah.
And she came on and we talked about personal purpose. And she said, yeah, I've got a very explicit personal purpose. And I said, well, what is it? And I'm going to try and pull this from my memory, so forgive me. And she said, I'm the sword of truth, the conduit of joy. I'm here to care for and challenge the powerful in order to galvanize their goodness to make the world a better place.
Wow.
Now that's quite an explicit, and I think I've got some of those words wrong, but it was sword of truth, conduit of joy, to care for and challenge the powerful, to galvanize their goodness to make the world a better place. And I remember when she said that, I thought, wow. And the trial lawyer in me was making notes as she did this. And I went back and she said, I've got to ask you about that. And I asked her about every single component. So,
yes.
Conduit, sword of truth.
I was interested in the second one.
Conduit of joy.
Yeah.
I asked her about all of them, and she could answer explicitly why she had chosen every single word, what it meant to her, where it came from in her life. And that was a very, very active North Star in relation to how she showed up and how she impacted some of the most powerful people in the world. And again, some of the leaders that I've spoken to who have had very strong personal purposes, which are aligned to their organizational purpose, but can be different, have found that as great comfort in times of huge uncertainty. And it's allowed them to navigate some of the grey areas that we've just spoken about. So I was deeply impressed by that. And it's a conversation I have with leaders all the time. We say, do you really understand what your personal purpose is? And can you articulate that to other people so that they know what your direction of travel is when the whole world's gone mad?
Yeah. I mean, that's I'm still digesting exactly what all that means.
It's pretty cool, isn't it?
It sounds quite. I mean, it's almost like trying to approach it as an academic's sort of view. Like but it's really interesting.
But it had taken a huge amount of thought.
Yeah.
And iteration.
Yeah. Do you have something similar?
I'm working on it, and that's a great question because actually, on many of the occasions, I've thought, oh, hang on, I'm finding myself lacking at the moment. And so what I'm doing at the moment, and I'm getting other leaders to do this, is think about what are the building blocks that will make up your personal purpose. So I just picked two that I think are relevant to me. One is around energy. I thrive off energy, and really that's how I tend to show up as the energy or an energetic individual. And the other one is this insatiable curiosity piece as well. So I'm working on what are those blocks, and then how might I craft that into a personal purpose, which I'm sure will change over time as well. So it's interesting because I'm having these conversations with leaders. I'm thinking to myself, hang on, we're all work in progress. How can I internalize that, and should I be thinking about that as well? To which the answer is yes. So it's probably got you thinking as well in relation to your personal purpose, and how is that aligned to the business, and how does that guide you through uncertainty?
Yeah, my purpose has evolved because I've been fortunate to be relatively successful within a business context.
Yeah.
And the previous role I had to Clue was around software that we sold to airlines, and our big strapline when we were doing that was we can increase your ancillary revenue by 20%. And it was great, and I really enjoyed that, and that was a sort of real profit orientated thing. And then coming into Clue all those years ago, it's so much more powerful. Our impact, our thing we can do is we can help you to either save lives or to reduce risk of fraud or to help protect children from, it's that impact.
Yeah.
That is the big motivator. And then it grows, right? So then actually it's about impact at scale, because, we could help 4 organizations with that, and that would be very fulfilling. But if we can get lots of organizations all contributing, we can do it at much more scale. So then my motivating factor is impact at scale.
Yeah.
That's what I...
Well, when you say impact, what kind of impact are you talking about?
I mean harm reduction.
Right.
I mean improvements in criminal justice. I mean making the world demonstrably and tangibly safer.
You're talking about human impact.
Yes.
And we know that's much more attractive, especially to the younger generation, because those old purposes that used to be, what's your purpose to increase shareholder value?
Yeah.
Are not compelling.
Yeah.
I'm not naive to the fact that every business has got to be commercially sustainable.
Yeah.
And it is okay, by the way, to make a profit.
Yeah.
But it's perhaps not as compelling as it was in the 80s and 90s now the younger generations are looking for something that is a much greater
Definitely.
purpose, which is what you're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, exactly. So, as fortunately, it's a line because for us, as more people adopt the software, we can contribute more to the product, and the product grows and the revenues grow.
Yeah.
So that's kind of really fortunate. But I've also seen that in our recruitment.
Yeah.
So we doubled in size during the pandemic, and that was quite interesting in itself because we did a whole load of interviewing on Teams and Zoom, and then a year later I met most of them, and everyone was like,
For the first time.
yeah, oh, you're taller than I expected, and usually for me it was, you're shorter than I expected. So that was a fun little thing. But all of our staff, we can't compete with Facebook on salaries and Google and salaries, right? So, but we can compete on purpose. Very much so. And when I speak to lots of our staff, they're like, yeah, actually it's the reason I'm here is that impact that is important to me.
And we're seeing, I've worked with a lot of the big tech companies, and there's bust and boom, and I think they're all going through changes again at the moment. We've seen huge amounts of layoff within the tech sector across the world. But I think, to your point, the younger generations, and actually it's not just the younger generations, because I worked with a lady called Raquel Ficardi, and she said actually that purpose was very different for the generations pre-pandemic, but actually purpose has become much more of a glue for the generations post-pandemic.
Yeah.
And I think there's a reason for that. There's this wonderful saying that, forgive me, I can't remember where it came from. They said, but when you press the pause button on a computer, it will stop. But when you press the pause button on a human being, that's when we start to think. And that's what the pandemic did. It pressed the big almighty pause button on everybody. Yeah. So I think a lot of people reflected deeply on what it was they were doing, what it was they wanted to do, whether they were having an impact and value, and what their purpose was in life. And I spoke to 3 CEOs of significant sized businesses who all used a phrase similar to, it's time to take the mask off. And I'd not heard that phrase before with people. So I think people have deeply reflected in relation to why they do what they do, not just what they do. And so that's something that is very compelling now for the generations, I think, right the way through. So it's interesting that we're having this conversation.
Yeah,
now.
It's going a slightly different direction, but this is interesting because what I think is interesting to our audience is we are seeing more purpose-led, people who are looking for more purpose.
Yep.
But for some reason, that's not translating into what I would say is the roles with some of the ultimate purpose, which is, going into law enforcement.
Yep.
Or more generally in investigative endeavor. People are they're having recruitment problems, right? In what I would say is the ultimate impact role. I have huge respect for people who are on the front line, and they're just looking at these roles, and I imagine, this is my opinion, looking at these roles thinking, well, why would I become a police officer? Look at the scrutiny. People are look at what's going on here. Right?
Yeah.
I wonder why with this movement and this impact movement, why we aren't seeing a resulting sort of boost in these sort of roles that are so.
I think you've landed on something really important, that some of the agencies that we're talking about, have they really thought about how compelling their purpose is? And I'll tell you a story. Every now and again I go back and I'll help the police, or I'll go and talk to young probationers coming through the system now. It's always a pleasure and a privilege to do that. And I remember saying to them, and actually there was a couple hundred in the audience, and I said, there's nothing stronger than the purpose you will have whilst you're wearing that uniform. And I had now probationers from all over the country in their various uniforms. And if I go back to a very strong memory for me, it was actually going back into uniform and turning up to a domestic violence call. And the male who had alleged, carried out the violence had gone, had been drinking and had scarpered. So 2 of us had turned up to the scene, and there was probably a female, not much older than me, there. And obviously all she sees are 2 police officers. And I remember we were standing in the hall, and she had some injuries, and making sure she was okay, and making sure the door was secure, and there were units searching for him outside. And I remember she had both hands wrapped around my arm to the extent that I could feel her nails almost digging into me. She didn't know she was doing it, but at that moment I thought to myself, she actually feels safe because she's grabbed hold of a police officer in uniform. And for me, that was a really powerful recollection of the power of the role and the purpose that I had to try and keep people safe. And I've always said, back in corporate life, and I work with some of the most iconic organizations, I'm not sure I'm going to feel the height of purpose that I did when I had that uniform on. So I think you've hit on a very good point now for those agencies that do such important work, safeguarding, protecting people from all kinds of criminality, whether it's criminal or civil. That's an enormously powerful purpose. Have those organisations really dialed up and thought about that purpose now, especially for the generations who work within them and the generations who might be attracted to work with them. But that's probably another episode in itself, isn't it?
Yeah. And do you think that's it? Do you think it's mostly, that angle, or do you think there's another wider issue with how our media and how the world perceives the people, the organisations that are undertaking this work?
Yes, and then it comes back to the point. Then it's probably even more important for people to think about what is the purpose of the organisation and how can those inside an agency provide something that is more of an impact. Look, one of the biggest questions I get from huge organisations is actually how can we be a force for good? How can we be a force for good for the communities within which we operate? So that's beyond an app or a paycheck or just a product or a service. Everyone now wants to know, how do you become a force for good? But I think that's a big piece again for the younger generations, is what is my lived experience going to be within this organisation, and what is going to be their footprint for good and positive impact within the world.
Yeah.
And you don't have to be a huge multi-billion-dollar business for that. You can be a startup.
Yeah. I mean, so we work a bit in this sort of space. Organisations like MasterCard, and I'm not talking specifically about MasterCard, are at a real epicenter of the facilitation of economic crime, because people move money and money laundering and all these sorts of things, and there's lots of challenges in just generally in this area, and I don't mean MasterCard specifically, but if I were to be looking at say working at MasterCard, and I had the domain expertise that perhaps some of our listeners do, around understanding of harm reduction, around prevention of wrongdoing, around investigations and intelligence, I would be looking at an organisation like that and thinking about my purpose within that, which is, hold on a minute, I can reduce. I can do something here. We can do some work around prevention of economic crime. We can look at some of the facilitators. We can, I would see MasterCard or working at any sort of organisation like that as a real opportunity to do good. Yeah,
be a force for good.
Yeah, be a force for good.
Yeah, I think it's a huge part now, I think, of everyone's psyche.
Yeah. That's an interesting line of thought. So perhaps we go back to thinking about one of the questions I had for you was you've had a highly successful podcast. Congratulations on your 200th session.
We got there.
Which was a footballer, I think pre my time, Viv Anderson.
Yeah.
Yes, and timely because of the Euros and etc.
Yes, actually, we didn't quite plan it like that, but it came out very well. So Viv Anderson, anyone who doesn't know, was former England. He was made British sporting history as the first black player to play a full England international, and he's ex-Arsenal, Manchester United, one of the first signings for Alex Ferguson, and Nottingham Forest played under the iconic Brian Clough. Yeah. So he had some stories to tell.
Wow, yeah. I haven't listened to that. I've listened to a few, but I haven't listened to that one yet. But I wonder whether there are one or two examples. You mentioned that you've interviewed Chris Dorr, who we know, but just any standout sort of interviews that you've had that you think might be relevant for this discussion and for our audience on everything we've sort of spoken about so far.
I think I've been asked this question after I wrote the book, and the book had 150,000 data points crunched by someone far wiser than me, and now with over 200 episodes. I've been asked a number of times, what are you seeing float to the top?
Yeah.
Is there a critical differentiator now for those leading? And this is relevant to anyone in a leadership position, so it doesn't matter whether it's within a criminal justice agency or it doesn't matter, because we're talking about people.
Yeah.
Because at the moment we only hire people. So that's why this is relevant. And I think for me, my immediate answer was the rise of human-centered leadership. And I think especially with generative AI at the moment, that is taking over some of the technical things that we used to rely on.
Yeah.
But what AI is doing for us is it's giving us more time to be human.
Yeah.
And therefore more time to connect, stay connected, reconnected with people. So I think at the moment, the rise, and I call it leadership superpowers, the rise of human-centered leadership, I think is important for anyone in any leadership position in any organization. Big, medium, small, it doesn't matter. And I've spoken to lots of people about this, and it keeps coming up, regardless of where they might be. And I've had the FBI, the Secret Service, the Metropolitan Police, the military, Michelin star chefs, ballerinas, deliberately been an eclectic mix of people. So this keeps coming up. And I think there are lessons that people are now going back in their careers and thinking, actually, what was the biggest lesson for me? And it keeps coming back to human-centered leadership. And I can give you a few examples.
Yeah,
but
please. Yeah.
I'll give you one that, because we were on the theme of football, we spoke to Stuart Pearce, and Stuart Pearce is, again, former England, played Nottingham Forest. He's now still a pundit. You'll hear his voices on many of the Euro matches as well.
Yeah. So missed the penalty.
Missed the penalty. Well, that was it in 1990. Yeah. Was it Italian 90 where he missed a penalty in front of 1 billion people? And what do you do with that? Well, he remembers actually missing the penalty, and he talks about this in the episode. He misses the penalty with the world watching. Germany score, they go through. This is a semi-final. And he just gets called into, because it's random, he gets called into a urine sample test at the end of the match. So he goes into that, and I think he's with Peter Shilton, he says, and he's with 2 German players. And bearing in mind that he's just lost a semi-final, they've just won a semi-final, he said those 2 German players sat in complete silence out of respect of what had just happened before they went in for his urine sample. And he just remembers that was an extraordinary display of humility. And that's something he's carried with him. And he talks about in a later tournament, I think England put Spain out, where we won the penalty shootout and they stopped. And he remembered that lesson. So he wasn't celebrating in the faces of the Spanish players on the pitch, but actually would wait until he got back into the dressing, because he remembered the impact of the humility of the German players on him. And so humility is one of the 8 components of human-centered leadership. But I'm just looking for examples of this in the people that I speak to. But if I had to highlight one thing that has come out now, it's actually care. Now, you might be surprised at that or not, but care is a massive piece when we're talking to leaders, again, in any organisation. Because I always say to people, if you don't care about people, then please don't lead. Let's just say that up front. And I just remember one other example. I chatted to Ralph Della Vega. Ralph Della Vega was the vice chairman of AT&T, which is a Fortune 10 company. Now, Ralph's got an incredible story. Again, you can see and hear this. He came to the US from Cuba at the age of 10. And he heard 5 words when he was at the border with his family. He had made a decision to relinquish all of their assets to the regime and come to the safety of the US. And he was a 10-year-old boy. And when they got to the border, he heard the words, "Only the boy can go." So you can imagine, as a parent, to have to make the decision about, well, you will let your 10-year-old cross the border by himself without the family. And they made that decision, and he did. He had not a red cent to his name. He didn't speak English, and he spent 4 years in the US without his family. But that little 10-year-old boy went on to become the vice chairman of AT&T, a Fortune 10 company, where he's worked with people like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Steve Jobs. He actually shared the stage with Steve Jobs during the iPhone. And we were chatting away, and I thought, this is probably one of his best memories, is probably going to be around and it wasn't. Actually, his best memory, he said, was out of all of the people that he led and cared for, 24 of them went on to be CEOs in their own right in relation to small, medium, or large. And for him, that's a massive accolade to, hopefully he led in a way that just cared for them and allowed them to experience and get what they needed in order to go on and excel within their own careers. That was what he wanted to pull out from the conversation. So I thought that was a great example of someone who had come from humble beginnings, go on one of the most senior executives in one of the biggest firms, but said it was all about how he felt he may have set up the environment or cared for those who went on to do great things, not who he was working with.
And do you think is this noticeably different to 10? What sort of timescale do you think this is we're alluding to here? Do you think this is sort of different to 10 years ago? Is it sort of post-pandemic? Is human-centered leadership, is this a thing that you feel is much more prevalent now and it will continue to become more prevalent, and why?
I think it is more prevalent. It's always been there. There's been this human connection.
Human nature.
I think the pandemic was a magnifier on this. I think it it sped it up in relation to its level of importance. I think after the pandemic as well, a lot of people felt the need to connect, reconnect, and stay connected with people. And I'll come back to the point that with AI, a lot of people think that AI is going to change the world, or it's a disaster, or it's the best thing. You know, you'll get different answers from different people. But I come back to that piece that when we think about AI, it's going to allow humans to be more human and have time to do it. So I think now a lot of organizations are looking for people who can really dial up on the human-centered components as well as just their technical proficiency. Because I know lots of people have been best in class in relation to X, but then second or third rate leaders because they've just never been given the opportunity or the time or cut themselves some slack to really think about how they will lead other people.
Yeah.
So it's so important.
I think, perhaps that sounds like a bit towards the end when we talk about our crystal ball moment, we could maybe touch on AI and the intersection of AI and leadership. One thing is you alluded to 8 leadership traits earlier. I just wonder if there's any others that you could pick out that you think might be particularly interesting here. Yeah,
well, I mean, curiosity is one.
Yeah.
You're going to test me now. And personal purpose, which we spoke about, is another one. Vigilance, inclusivity, empathy. Oh, wow. I'm not going to remember all 8, but I'll share those with you and you can put them in there. And again, this is just a point of view, but these are just the components that I'm seeing coming up again and again and again and again. And they're having a significant impact on people. And it's the classic adage, isn't it? If you look after your people, they'll look after the business. And I'm just seeing more and more evidence of this now come out from the conversations that I'm having, the research that I'm doing.
Yeah. I mean, I can see it. I mean, should we have a quick digression into AI? I think it would be remiss of us not to. It's one of those hot topics at the moment, and I agree. You know, AI will free us up to have more quality time. Define quality time as you wish.
Yeah.
But I can see that happening. So I wonder what your reflections are in terms of the progression of AI within leadership and within people on the one hand, and then I think we should have a little delve into AI within the context of intelligence investigations, because I would argue there's a slightly different dynamic in there, but perhaps you might disagree.
Well, I'm no AI expert, so I'll rely on you for that element. But I had an amazing conversation actually with another guest. I just wrote it down to make sure I haven't got this wrong, but it was Thomas Chamora Pramusic, who actually I saw very recently. We were in Switzerland together. And he really has thought about this, is doing a lot of keynotes about it. And I remember we had a conversation and I called the episode The AI Microwave Meal. And I was fascinated by this. And I remember him saying, let me get this right, because we can talk about this.
Yeah.
That he actually said that AI in some ways is our ability to find out anything through an easy, fast, lazy and more ways free manner. So he almost says it's like the microwave roux. It's not very nutritional. And actually, if you really know your subject matter, what AI throws out, if you're a real expert in it, you'll probably see where the mistakes are, where the gaps quite quickly. But the reality is we can all get to know something about something almost instantaneously.
Yeah.
But there is a danger with that as well in relation to what's actually being put in the first place and what's it throwing out. So in some ways, there's a debate as well, isn't there, about whether the product of AI is actually the product of our narcissism and our biases that have all been put in the front end and now coming out the back end. And I think something that he spoke about resonated with me is actually how do we slow cook ideas? How do we again really start to think about the importance of the human element to create, to innovate, to collaborate, to challenge in order to come to perhaps a more informed decision. So maybe AI can do so much, but it's not going to replace some of those innate, again, human-centered qualities that we have. So I wonder whether you're seeing that again, the importance of the human being in an investigation when it comes to looking at data as opposed to some kind of machine learning or AI-driven result. There's probably a balance and a danger and a benefit. I don't know what are you seeing there.
Well, first of all, it's early days.
Yeah.
So we need to temper, there's a lot of commercial interest. We're at this sort of peak of excitement around AI. So there's a lot of commercial interest, but of course, fundamentally, it's still, looking at historic data, often data from 2021 and before, in some cases. So it's still looking at historic information, and it's doing it very, very amazingly well in terms of interpreting, what you want and what the answers you want. But it is biased. Let's just call that. It's biased by the people who have developed it, and the information that it's searching. It is just biased. We just got to accept that. And it's only as good as the data that's been created. It's been created on. So if the data is not clean and not sensible, then it's not going to be sensible data. So there's just so much, when we're talking about, can you give me a start of a 10 for a webinar I've got to run next week on, criminal justice, it'll give you a good start of 10, I imagine. You'll get a good sort of, that's a good idea, and that's a good idea, and that's this and the other. So on simple, what I would call simple, relatively low risk, if they give me 3 ideas that are rubbish, I'll just go, well, they're rubbish. It's not about to be an issue, I think.
But that's you sieving through that. That's you making the decision that I'll use that, but I won't use that.
Yes.
There comes the important part.
Yes. But for me, that's all the stuff that exists already, and that will develop and that will get better, and we'll get better at teaching these models our style. And talk about prompting. There's a whole world of prompting, isn't there? And there's going to be developing. So from a personal perspective, I can see lots of opportunities to increase productivity. But then the challenge you've got is, I think the EU AI Act starts to think about this quite well. It's an interesting piece of legislation, but at its core are concepts like data protection and privacy, and this concept of high risk areas. So high risk areas are where personal freedoms can be inhibited. So crime is one of them. Law enforcement is one of them. So you can imagine. I mean, just back to your context of being a barrister, or being being a defence lawyer, right? If you're presented with a load of information as part of a case file, an ongoing investigation, where many of the conclusions have been as a result of some form of AI, where are you going to go? You're going to be tackling that, aren't you? Okay, what's the provenance of that, and how did you get about that, and all that sort of stuff. So there's that. That is a really, really contentious, challenging area of AI for the world that we work in, and rightly so, because hallucinations happen frequently. Every time I do some sort of relatively complex set of queries on an AI platform, at some point you notice a hallucination, as I might define it. So it's happening, and so there's just a whole load of challenge around that, and how we build solutions to maintain personal freedom, maintain privacy, but make the world safer. And we're just so early in that thinking that we just have to be careful and think about it properly.
I think one of the challenges that I also saw as a lawyer and as a police officer, which still exists now, is that technology is advancing at such a rate that the legislation and policy simply can't keep up with it. So there's always going to be this enormous gap between what can we do, how do we operate, what are the guidelines, are we doing something correctly, are we doing something incorrectly, are we being lawfully, legally audacious, where do we sit? So that grey area is expanding and will always continue to expand, because the policymakers can't hope to keep up with just the rate of change from a technological point of view. So I think that is something that's going to be very, very relevant to your listeners.
I think just to add to that, one of the things that I think we've realised when we sort of looked into this, we have a general counsel in house, which is just really important, because as we navigate these challenges, and actually there's some principles that are just really important to adhere to that aren't actually anything to do with AI. They're to do with privacy, and they're to do with data protection. Don't secure information. They're to do with quality of data. You can't possibly apply AI to data that hasn't been collected properly, right? So actually what it means is back to basics. How are you collecting that information? Does it sit in a clean format? Have you structured it in the right way? Because as soon as you apply anything to information that isn't structured properly, you're going to get hallucinations. So the reality is, for commercial environments, I imagine, but certainly law enforcement environments, we've got to proactively take a step back and ensure the data quality is very, very high, and that we're not breaking any rules around data privacy, GDPR, all those sorts of things, before you apply models, because as soon as you apply the models, you're going to amplify the problems, and then you're also going to amplify the lack of the diversity issue, the homogenization issue. So you don't want to sort of risk that either. So
there's a lot going on, and I think to myself, to go back to the analog days, if I found a knife on the street as part of an investigation, and I'm bagging that up and taking back, the big buzz phrases were continuity and integrity. So how are those now relevant to what you've just described? Because it's now incredibly more complex.
But it's complex. But I think the reflection I have is it's the same. So we're speaking to
some of the principles are the same.
Yes. So yes, exactly. So the analogy is that we had a lady called Jane Cowell as one of our recordings, and she was senior intelligence positions at the Metropolitan Police and within the defence sector and insider threats, so national security threats, insider threats, all that sort of stuff. Fascinating conversation. But she started her tradecraft in the 80s, when they're talking about indexing, not databases, pre-databases, cards, right? And she said, and of course, it was all about the quality of the person, the indexer. So you found a good indexer, you really kept with them because you knew you were getting good quality information. I said that's exactly the same now. I mean, literally, you need a good quality intelligence analyst who understands tradecraft, who understands data, and understands principles of investigation. It's the same thing. And even with AI, we come forward another 10 years. We're getting into our last bit here. Those same principles will still apply. And of course, the other thing, back to the point around being questioned in court, what we know to be a fact is that any conclusions, any recommendations, any insights that data gives, you need to absolutely be very clear about how. Transparency of data, transparency of how it's come to certain conclusions, and never overriding human decision making. So really, all that I think that technology in our space needs to do is accelerate the ability for a person to make a good decision, not, in my opinion, to make decisions on behalf of people.
And it comes back to the rationale that we spoke about. It's all part of the workings out, which have led to, as you say, a human decision. What have you based it on, and why have you done that?
Yeah, which kind of comes back round to your point, which is ultimately all these things will free up, hopefully, time for whatever. In your personal life, it might be you get more time to reflect, to do some self-reflection. In a professional context, you might get more time to think strategically about how to, track down a criminal, or how to avoid something bad happening. You're freeing up time to do more, thought-based, human-centered, to come back to your language, sort of logic.
I agree. And I think that's going to get dialed up even further now with the amount of time that we hopefully get back with the systems that are in place. And we're already at the beginning of the journey still.
Yeah.
So just watch this space.
Yes, exactly right. So perhaps now is a good, we've kind of bled into it a little bit, but should we actively go into the sort of final part of our session, which is where we sort of transport ourselves into 2030 and we think about what will be true, what won't be true within the domain that we've been speaking about, which broadly speaking, leadership and criminal, within the criminal justice and safety centres and all that sort of stuff. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, a few thoughts. I think a lot of people are worried about the future of work. What is technological advance or AI going to do to jobs? Well, it is going to get rid of lots and lots of jobs, without a shadow of a doubt. But I also think it will create lots and lots of jobs.
Yep.
As yet, we don't know what those are. So one of the biggest challenges, again, we were chatting in the car on the way up on this, is actually also what are the skills that are required in order to those jobs of the future, which we don't know what they'll be. That's an issue, because how do you start to prepare for the jobs of the future if you simply don't really know what they are and what are the skills or capabilities that you need? And I think that's a place that I have to sit with many organizations. And we spoke, I think, briefly about this to say, at a point in time today, a business is somewhere, but every business has an aspiration to go somewhere else, to achieve something in the future. The question now is, what are the skills and capabilities that organization needs in order to make that destination a reality?
Yeah.
I think that's a little tricky at the moment, because there may well be, as I say, roles, positions and requirements that you need that you can't identify. Therefore, you've literally got no clue how to prepare for it.
Yeah.
So I think there's another level of uncertainty and ambiguity in the system, which is creating some some issues for leaders as they start to think, well, hang on, where are we going on? Who do we need and what do we need for it?
Yeah.
Are you finding that at all? Even you as a leader of a business, think to yourself, we're on a journey, but who do we need and what do we need?
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. An analogy. I'm not sure if it'll work on over sort of audio, but I'm going to try and explain it. But an analogy that resonated with me was that if you think about a circle, right? You've got a circle, and imagine that's your job, right? And you look at it and you go, this is what I do. I broadly understand what I need to do. And do you know what? Lots of there's loads of stuff within there that I'm not getting around to. Most people in their roles do what they can, but they know that there's stuff they're prioritizing. They're sort of saying, well, I'm just never going to get round to that, so I need to focus on these areas. So you've got a big circle, and within there you've got a smaller circle of the stuff you actually get to, right? So that's how most people would see their jobs. I think what you need to do with AI is take a step back from that and go, okay, there's actually a box that's this big that sits around that circle, and that is the box of possibility in the future, right? So I need to be open-minded to the fact that yes, certain of these tasks and certain of these things might not be there in the future, but actually there's going to be a whole remit of areas that will free up and will only present themselves when eventually we get to the point where we don't have to think about that. So we're going to get into much more, multifaceted, interesting areas of thought that I think, as you say, I'm an optimist in this area, but that I think will more than compensate for the obvious things in the short term that are going to change. Not obvious, but the things that are going to change.
I think the term that I hear a lot, and you probably hear it too, is agility. Is how can an organisation be agile and the people within it be agile? And there are many answers to that, but I think one of the things that comes up a lot is just people having a learning mindset.
Yeah.
And you've probably heard of Carol Dweck's growth mindset work, but a learning mindset, because we're all work in progress. And I think at the moment, with things changing so much, it doesn't matter how senior you are, whether you're the founder, the CEO of the business, you've got to continuously have that learning mindset, because things are changing so quickly that what you did or what got you here is not going to get you to where you're going. So I think it's that ability to unlearn as fast as you can learn. Yeah,
and also have a supporting culture around you. So we're going through this at the moment. Right? We're operationalizing AI within Clue. It's an initiative we're working on, and it's just enabling a culture of experimentation and understanding. And there is anxiety. I think when you in lots of people's roles, you think, well, hang on a minute. The AI started to...
It's the uncertainty.
It started to eat into the white collar work, didn't it? Initially we thought robots and white and blue collar, and and now it's everything. And I think some people are nervous about that, but we've just got to provide the safety and security to help people experiment, and also I think the optimism, not uneducated optimism, the optimism to say this will work. There will be more opportunities for development, because that's how the world works.
No, I agree with you. And I think we just have to watch with interest, but the changes are just so fast that's where the uncertainty creeps in.
Yeah, totally agree. So any other reflections in terms of your sort of world in 2030 more widely?
Well, I do. I mean, the world has gone slightly bonkers, I always say that, and I've got 2 teenagers, so I do worry what the world will look like for them. I try and be, as you say, the optimist, not the pessimist. But I've kind of not really done a lot of crystal ball gazing, especially when I kind of try and in some ways inspire them to relation to what they could do. Mm-hmm. I think the biggest thing is that it's actually for the younger generation, it's really the art of the possible. I think the world has become a smaller place as well. You can really do anything, go anywhere, be anyone you want. But I think I come back to being very open-minded and having a learning mindset, because it's very difficult to predict where we're going. It's almost easier to make sure that we've got the skills and the capabilities and the mindset to be ready to take advantage of where we end up.
And I guess the other point that you've made a number of times is regardless of where things go, from a technical, from a, operational, from that sort of perspective, human skills are always going to be there. And in fact, they're going to amplify.
They're dialing up.
Most likely.
Yeah, they are.
So, in terms of advice, I'm not speaking for you here, but you might give to listeners, it's, hone in on those sort of human skills, because that's always going to be the area that's going gonna keep you?
It's the differentiator. And some people say to them, they're the soft skills. I think that's the wrong way of describing, because I think they're some of the hardest skills. So, and I'm not in any way downgrading, listen, it took me a long time to become a lawyer. So I'm not downgrading people's competence and expertise and their qualifications. They've worked incredibly hard for that. But that's only going to take them so far when it comes to leading through others. Because as soon as you start to lead people, that's when the human-centered piece becomes more and more and more important. And I do think the pandemic magnified that, and there'll be something else, and then there'll be something else, and then there'll be something else, which continues to magnify. Yeah. And I've said this before, that ability to connect, stay connected and reconnected with people at a deeper level. I'll just give you one example, which you may have this experience as well. Before the pandemic, we'd walk past each other, go, hey, how are you doing? Yeah, great. How are you doing? Yeah, fine. And actually, it was just a cursory way. But during the pandemic, I saw more examples of people saying, how are you doing? No, really. How are you doing? And I think that was the start of me starting to see more evidence of people starting to care much more about the depth of the person, not just about the ability of the person to do something. So I ask this question all the time. I say, how was the pandemic for you? And I get a variety. Some people say it was a disaster. Some people say they're ambivalent. And some people say it was the most amazing time they've ever experienced. You said, you doubled in growth, or your organization grew during the pandemic. That's okay, that variety of answers. But I think what it does highlight is that the pandemic was a deeply personal experience for everyone. And everyone started to question what it is they were doing and why they were doing it. And that's the people that lead you or you report to the people who report to you, and those around you. So I think, I'm going to finish with something that's important to me. A lot of people say, why are you so passionate about this whole theme of leadership? And I remember my first leader role as a young lawyer. And I told my mentor that, who's now passed, unfortunately. He was a larger-than-life Floridian trial lawyer. And I never forget his advice. And he said this. He said, congratulations, Adam. And then he said this. He said, remember, the children of the people that you lead know your name. In what context is entirely up to you. And that's never left me. But what it's highlighted is that leadership is deeply personal. And I think that's the conversation that I'm having with people now more and more, is the personal element of being a leader who can inspire and lead others through what is now enormous uncertainty.
Quite right. Thank you. That's a great place to end. Okay. And can I finish by saying thank you very, very much.
Pleasure.
For coming all the way down to sunny Bristol to have this podcast. It's been fascinating, real eye opener. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. I hope it's useful.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Joining the Dots with me, Thomas Strohan. We hope you found today's conversation practical and insightful. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review on your favourite podcast platform. It really helps us reach more listeners like you. Stay tuned for more episodes where we continue to uncover the stories of those on the front line of justice, harm reduction and global security. This is Thomas Strohan, signing off. Thanks for listening.